August 11th, 1919, Shadowbrook Estate, Lenox, Massachusetts. A man who once controlled more wealth than entire nations lay dying in a bedroom overlooking the Berkshire Mountains. His fortune at its peak, $380 million. In today's money, adjusting for both inflation and economic growth, that's somewhere north of $500 billion. More than the GDP of Sweden at the time, more than the entire annual budget of the United States government. Andrew Carnegie built an empire that literally reshaped the physical landscape of America. His steel became the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, the elevated railways that transformed Manhattan, the framework of the first true skyscrapers in Chicago, the railroads that finally connected the Pacific coast to the Atlantic. When people talk about the backbone of the Industrial Revolution, that's not metaphor. That's Carnegie steel, forged in mills that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for decades. But in his final hour, as his 83-year-old body finally surrendered after months of fighting bronchial pneumonia, he didn't call for his lawyers, not his accountants, not his business partners, not his daughter or his closest advisors. He called for his nurse, a 44-year-old woman named Margaret Bower, who had cared for him for the last 2 years of his life and had absolutely no financial stake in preserving his legacy or reputation. And what he whispered to her in those final moments, recorded in her private journal and deliberately hidden from public view for 47 years after his death, would contradict everything the history books tell you about the greatest philanthropist America ever knew. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. I cover the economic stories they don't teach you in school every single week. The ones that make powerful people uncomfortable. The ones that reveal how fortunes are really built, how power actually works, and what happens when the cameras finally turn off. Most people know Andrew Carnegie as the ultimate rags to riches story. The penniless Scottish immigrant who arrived in America with nothing, became the richest man in the country through hard work and innovation, then gave it all away to benefit humanity. The story is almost mythological in American culture. There are 2,509 Carnegie libraries spread across the English-speaking world, not an estimate. That's the actual documented number. Walk into almost any American town founded before 1920, and if there's a public library, there's a good chance Carnegie funded it. Universities from Pittsburgh to Scotland bear his name. Carnegie Hall in New York, Carnegie Mellon University, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. These institutions are still operating, still dispensing millions of dollars every year, nearly a century after his death. He wrote books and essays about the moral obligations of the wealthy. His most famous piece, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889, became one of the most influential economic philosophers in American history. Carnegie argued that dying rich was morally indefensible, that accumulating massive wealth was acceptable, even necessary, but only if you redistributed that wealth strategically before you died. He called wealthy men who hoarded their fortunes until death a disgrace to civilization. That essay made him famous beyond the business world. It made him an intellectual, a philosopher of capitalism. He became the model, the template, the blueprint that every modern billionaire points to when they want to justify their own accumulation. When Bill Gates and Warren Buffett created the Giving Pledge, explicitly asking billionaires to promise away most of their wealth, they cited Carnegie as the inspiration. Mackenzie Scott structures her giving based on Carnegie's principles. But here's what that heroic story leaves out. Carnegie didn't actually start giving his money away in any significant quantity until he was 66 years old. He spent the first 50 years of his adult life, half a century, accumulating that fortune through business practices so brutal they triggered federal investigations, congressional hearings, armed uprisings by his own workers, and deaths that nobody bothered counting accurately because immigrant labor was considered disposable. And that nurse who sat with him at the end. Margaret Bower kept detailed private notes about everything Carnegie said to her during his final 2 years. Those notes didn't surface publicly until 1966, 47 years after his death. When they finally did, they painted a picture of Andrew Carnegie that contradicted almost everything in the official biographies. A man who, in private, away from the foundations and the buildings, with his name carved in stone, admitted things he would never have said publicly. The notes described a man haunted, not by guilt in the traditional sense. Carnegie never believed his business methods were morally wrong. He operated within the accepted rules of capitalism at the time. He did what the system not only allowed, but actively rewarded. But he was haunted by the cost, by specific names and faces he couldn't forget even decades later, by the question of whether 2,000 libraries could balance the scales against the men who died in his mills. Andrew Carnegie was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, on November 25th, 1835. His father, William Carnegie, was a master weaver, not a factory worker, a skilled independent craftsman who owned his own loom and made a decent middle-class living producing damask linen. The Carnegie family lived comfortably, not wealthy, but secure. Andrew grew up in a world where craftsmanship meant something, where skilled labour commanded respect and fair compensation. Then the power loom arrived, automated weaving technology that could produce fabric faster and cheaper than any human craftsman. Within 2 years, William Carnegie's entire trade collapsed. He couldn't compete with machines. His skills, developed over decades, became economically worthless overnight. The family went from comfortable middle class to desperately poor, so fast it left psychological scars on young Andrew that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. Andrew, age 11, watched his father beg for work that no longer existed. He watched his mother Margaret take in laundry and mending to keep the family from starving. He watched skilled craftsmen reduced to begging, and he internalized a lesson that would define his business philosophy. The lesson wasn't about the injustice of technological disruption. It was about power. The people who controlled the machines won. The people who depended on their labor lost. Andrew Carnegie decided in those formative years that he would never, under any circumstances, be on the losing side of that equation again, no matter what it took. In 1848, when Andrew was 12, the family gave up and immigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They borrowed money for the passage. They arrived with essentially nothing. William Carnegie found occasional work in a cotton mill but never regained his dignity or earning power. It was clear from the beginning that Andrew would need to support the family. His first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, working 12-hour days for $1.20 per week. 12-hour days at age 12. Then he became a telegraph messenger boy. Then a telegraph operator, which required learning Morse code and developing quick processing skills. Then, through a combination of competence and strategic relationship building, he became personal assistant to Thomas Scott, a superintendent at the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is where Carnegie's real education began. Thomas Scott taught him how American business actually worked, not the version they teach in economics classes, the real version, how to manipulate stock prices, how to get insider information on land purchases before railroad routes were announced, how to structure deals so you profited whether the company succeeded or failed, how to use political connections to secure government contracts, how to position yourself to benefit from other people's labor, capital, and risk. By age 24, Carnegie was superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. He wasn't just good at his job, he was ruthless about identifying every possible angle for personal profit. When the railroad needed bridge construction, Carnegie invested in a bridge company, then awarded contracts to himself. When the railroad needed sleeping cars, he invested in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company, then made sure Pennsylvania Railroad bought their products exclusively. Then came the Civil War. While men his age were dying at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh, Carnegie stayed in Pennsylvania. Perfectly safe. Managing railroads, yes, but also getting extraordinarily wealthy, selling the Union Army everything from railroad ties to telegraph wire to iron at prices that made his fortune. He was 29 years old when the war ended, worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. After the war, Carnegie looked at the American economy and saw something almost everyone else missed. The country was about to explode. The railroad boom was just beginning. Cities were growing at rates nobody had predicted. Immigration was flooding the labor market with desperate workers. And all of it, every bit of the coming expansion, would require one material more than any other: steel. In 1873, he founded Carnegie Steel Company in Pittsburgh. The popular story says Carnegie succeeded because he innovated better than competitors, because he was smarter, worked harder, adopted new technologies faster. There's some truth there. But the real reason Carnegie Steel dominated American steel production had nothing to do with innovation. It had to do with ruthlessness. With a business model built on a simple principle that Carnegie understood better than his competitors. The fastest way to accumulate wealth in capitalism isn't through innovation or superior products. It's through market control, cost cutting to the absolute minimum, and the willingness to destroy anyone who stands in your way. Carnegie's strategy was brutally simple: cut costs to the bone, produce steel cheaper than any competitor could match, undercut their prices until they went bankrupt, buy up their assets at auction for pennies on the dollar, consolidate your control. Repeat. To cut costs, Carnegie needed cheap labor, very cheap labor. He found it in the massive waves of immigration flooding into America in the late 1800s. Desperate men from Eastern Europe, Ireland, Italy, men who spoke little or no English, men who had no other options, men who would work for wages that American-born workers wouldn't accept. Carnegie's mills ran on 12-hour shifts 7 days a week, with shift rotations every 2 weeks. That meant for one day during the rotation, a worker would labor for 24 hours straight. Not a typo, not an exaggeration. 24 continuous hours in a steel mill where the temperature regularly exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, where molten metal splashed, where machinery could tear off limbs, where a moment of exhaustion-induced inattention could mean death. The injury and death rates were staggering. In 1889 alone, just 1 year, Carnegie's plants officially reported 462 serious injuries. Serious meant permanent disability, lost limbs, severe burns, crushed bones, or death. That's the official number. The actual number was almost certainly much higher because minor injuries went unreported, and workers who complained too loudly about unsafe conditions simply got replaced. There was always another desperate immigrant at the gates willing to take the job. Carnegie himself rarely visited his mills. He spent most of his time in New York managing the business side, or in Scotland, where he bought an estate and played the role of returning conquering hero. He insulated himself from the physical reality of how his fortune was being built. His plant managers handled day-to-day operations. His accountants sent him profit reports. The workers were just numbers in ledgers. The breaking point came in 1892, the Homestead strike. This is the moment that should have destroyed Andrew Carnegie's reputation forever. It should be the first thing anyone learns when they hear his name. Instead, it's barely mentioned in most histories. Here's what actually happened. Carnegie's main plant was in Homestead, Pennsylvania, a small town just outside Pittsburgh that existed almost entirely to support the steel mill. The workers there were unionized. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was one of the strongest and most organized unions in America at the time. They had a contract with Carnegie Steel that was set to expire in June 1892. When negotiations began for a new contract, the union's demands were modest by any reasonable standard. They wanted a slight wage increase to keep pace with the company's exploding profits. They wanted the 12-hour shifts reduced to 10 hours. They wanted basic safety improvements like protective equipment and guards on dangerous machinery. Nothing radical. Nothing that would actually threaten Carnegie Steel's profitability. Carnegie refused. Not just the wage increase, not just the safety improvements. He decided to break the union entirely, to eliminate organized labor from his operations permanently. He put this plan in the hands of Henry Clay Frick, his partner and the company's chairman. Frick was known throughout American industry as one of the most viciously anti-labor executives in the country. His instructions from Carnegie were explicit and well documented in their correspondence. Crush the union. Do whatever it takes. I'll back you completely. Frick's plan was straightforward. He would lock the workers out of the plant. He would announce plans to hire replacement workers at lower wages with no union representation, and he would use force to make it happen. On June 29th, 1892, Frick locked the gates and posted notices that the plant would reopen July 6th with non-union workers. He built a fence around the entire facility, 15 feet high, topped with barbed wire. Workers started calling it Fort Frick. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents, which was essentially a private army. The Pinkertons were notorious. They were union busters for hire, armed mercenaries who specialized in violent strike-breaking. The locked-out workers, 3,800 men, barricaded the town. They organized patrols. They had no intention of letting replacement workers enter the plant. They had spent years building that union. They weren't giving it up without a fight. On July the 6th, the Pinkertons arrived by barge on the Monongahela River at 4 in the morning, hoping to enter the plant before the workers knew they were coming. But the workers were waiting. They had sentries posted along the river. When the Pinkertons tried to land, the workers opened fire. What followed was an actual battle. Not a protest that got out of hand. An armed battle on American soil between workers fighting for their union and a private army hired by one of the richest men in the world. The fighting lasted 14 hours. The Pinkertons had Winchester rifles. The workers had hunting rifles, pistols, whatever weapons they could find. They used dynamite. They pushed a burning rail car toward the barge. When it finally ended, 7 workers were dead. 3 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens more on both sides were wounded, some severely. The Pinkertons surrendered, and the workers allowed them to leave town after forcing them to run a gauntlet where they were beaten and humiliated. The workers thought they had won. They controlled Homestead. They had driven off the Pinkertons. The union was intact. But they misunderstood the game Carnegie and Frick were playing. 4 days later, the governor of Pennsylvania sent 8,000 state militia troops to Homestead, not to investigate the company's role in hiring a private army, not to mediate between labor and management, to break the strike by force. The troops occupied Homestead. They allowed replacement workers to enter the plant under armed guard. They arrested strike leaders and charged them with murder for the deaths of the Pinkertons. The strike collapsed within months. The union was destroyed. Carnegie Steel resumed operations with non-union workers at wages 20% lower than before. Production increased. Profits increased. Carnegie became even wealthier. And Andrew Carnegie, he was in Scotland the entire time, at his estate, Skibo Castle, playing golf, entertaining guests. He would later claim in his autobiography that he had no knowledge of Frick's plans, that he would never have approved hiring the Pinkertons, that the violence horrified him when he learned about it. This was a lie. The telegrams between Carnegie and Frick were preserved and surfaced decades later. Carnegie knew the entire plan. He approved every detail. And when it was over, when the union was broken and the workers were back at lower wages, Carnegie sent Frick a telegram. Not a reprimand, a congratulations. 3 years before Homestead, in 1889, Carnegie had published his essay, The Gospel of Wealth. In it, he laid out his philosophy that wealthy men had a moral duty to give away their fortunes during their lifetimes. The essay made Carnegie famous in intellectual circles. It gave him a reputation as a philosopher, not just a businessman. But when Carnegie published The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, he had not actually given away any significant amount of money. It was all theoretical, a philosophical argument with no personal sacrifice attached. He didn't actually start his philanthropic giving in earnest until 1901. He was 66 years old. He had just sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million. Only then, only after he had extracted every possible dollar from his business, only after decades of brutal labor practices and monopolistic market control, did he start building libraries. Between 1901 and his death in 1919, Carnegie gave away approximately $350 million. That number gets cited constantly as evidence of his generosity. But he kept $130 million. In today's money, that's multiple billions, more than enough for his family to live in extraordinary luxury for generations. And even the money he gave away came with strings attached. Carnegie Libraries required recipient cities to provide the land and commit to funding ongoing operations, which many small towns struggled to afford. His charitable foundations were structured specifically to ensure his name would live on in perpetuity, attached to institutions that would shape public opinion for generations after his death. This wasn't selfless giving. It was strategic reputation management. Carnegie was buying something with those donations. He was buying immortality. He was buying historical redemption. He was buying the right to be remembered as a philanthropist rather than as the man who hired the Pinkertons. And it worked. The Carnegie myth replaced the Carnegie reality in public consciousness within his own lifetime. This brings us back to Margaret Bower. She was 42 years old when she took the job as Carnegie's private nurse in 1917. She had trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the most prestigious nursing programs in America. She took the Carnegie position because it paid well and because, like most Americans at the time, she believed the myth. The Andrew Carnegie she actually met was 81 years old, physically frail and dying slowly of bronchial pneumonia, but his mind was still sharp. And as the months passed and his condition gradually worsened, something unexpected began to happen. He started talking to her. Not the carefully rehearsed stories he told journalists and biographers, the real stories. Margaret kept a journal. She didn't intend to publish it. It was just her way of processing what she was hearing. She wrote down conversations, his nightmares, the things he said when he thought no one important was listening. The journal stayed completely private until Margaret's death in 1972. Her daughter, going through her mother's papers, found it and decided it belonged in the Carnegie archives. She donated it to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh in 1966. The archivists who received it were stunned. It contradicted almost everything in the official Carnegie biography. The library accepted the journal but classified it as a restricted document. They didn't publicize its existence. Researchers who somehow learned about it and requested access often found their requests denied or indefinitely delayed. Only in recent decades has the journal become more accessible. But even now, most people who study Carnegie have no idea it exists. In an entry from March 1918, Margaret describes Carnegie waking from a nightmare at 3 a.m, calling out for Henry Clay Frick. Frick had died 2 years earlier. He and Carnegie hadn't spoken since 1900, but in his delirium, Carnegie kept asking for Frick. Kept asking whether the Pinkertons had arrived yet, whether the strikers were still at the gates. He was reliving Homestead. More than 25 years later, it was still there. In another entry from June 1918, Carnegie told Margaret about a letter he received in 1893, the year after Homestead. It was from the widow of one of the workers killed in the battle. Her husband's name was John Morris. He was 34 years old, father of 4 children. The widow, whose name was Hannah Morris, wrote asking whether Carnegie would help pay for the funeral, whether he would provide any assistance for her and the children. Carnegie told Margaret he threw the letter away without responding. But 35 years later, lying in his bed dying, he told Margaret he remembered the letter word for word. He remembered the woman's name, he remembered the ages of the children, and he said it bothered him that he never responded. In multiple entries throughout 1918 and 1919, Margaret describes Carnegie becoming increasingly obsessed with a single question. He asked her repeatedly whether she thought his libraries made up for the workers who died building his fortune. He didn't want a comforting answer. He wanted her honest opinion. Margaret, to her credit, refused to give him easy answers. She told him it wasn't her place to judge, but when he pressed, she told him that if he was asking the question, if he needed to ask whether the good balanced the bad, he probably already knew the answer. The final entry in Margaret Bower's journal is dated August 11th, 1919, the day Carnegie died. She describes his condition deteriorating throughout the morning, his breathing becoming more laboured, his periods of consciousness becoming shorter and more confused. His wife Louise and his daughter Margaret were in the room for most of the morning, but around 2 p.m. they stepped out briefly to speak with the doctor in the hallway. That's when Carnegie opened his eyes. He looked directly at Margaret Bower. He gestured for her to come closer. She leaned in next to his bed. His voice was barely a whisper. She had to put her ear close to his mouth to hear him. According to her journal, transcribed exactly as she wrote it that evening, he said 4 sentences. I didn't give it all away. I kept enough to make sure they would remember me. I thought that mattered. It doesn't. Margaret wrote that she didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. She just held his hand. He closed his eyes. Within 20 minutes, he was dead. Those 4 sentences were never included in any official account of Carnegie's death. But the nurse who was actually there, who had no reason to lie and no incentive to damage Carnegie's reputation, recorded something very different. A moment of clarity, a confession, an admission that the whole carefully constructed narrative was ultimately about ego, about immortality, about making sure his name lived on. And in his final conscious moment, he admitted it didn't work. This raises a question that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Can you do enough good to erase how you made your money in the first place? And if you give money away specifically to be remembered as a hero, is that actually philanthropy, or is it just the most expensive public relations campaign in history? The modern answer, the one that lets billionaires sleep at night, is that yes, you can redeem problematic wealth accumulation through strategic giving, that Carnegie proved it's possible, that the libraries matter more than the labor practices, but that answer requires ignoring what Carnegie himself said at the end. It requires pretending his final words don't exist. The economic implications go deeper than just Carnegie's personal redemption. His model, the accumulate ruthlessly then give strategically model, has become the blueprint for modern billionaire philanthropy. Bill Gates made his fortune through monopolistic business practices at Microsoft that triggered federal antitrust lawsuits. But he's remembered as a philanthropist because of the Gates Foundation. Jeff Bezos built Amazon on the backs of warehouse workers with injury rates that rival industrial-era factories. Mark Zuckerberg presided over a company that literally helped undermine democracy in multiple countries. The pattern is the same. Accumulate wealth through any means necessary. Then give some of it away with your name attached and wait for the gratitude to replace the criticism. Carnegie invented this. He proved it works. He showed that if you give away enough money in visible enough ways, people will eventually forget how you got it. Except Carnegie himself, at the very end, admitted it did matter, that he hadn't escaped judgment, that the libraries hadn't balanced the scales, that keeping enough money to ensure his name lived on forever was pointless, because immortality bought with blood money isn't actually worth having. Margaret Bower lived until 1972. She gave exactly one interview after her journal became public, in 1967. The interviewer asked her directly whether she thought Andrew Carnegie was a good man. She said she didn't think good and bad were useful categories for someone like Carnegie, that he did both tremendously good and tremendously terrible things, both on a scale that most people couldn't comprehend. That the question wasn't whether he was good or bad, the question was whether the good outweighed the terrible. And she said only the people who actually suffered under his business practices had the right to answer that question. Not her, not historians, not the people who used his libraries, only the workers who died in his mills and the families they left behind. Those people can't answer the question. The workers who died at Homestead are long gone. Hannah Morris and her 4 children, the family Carnegie ignored when they asked for help. There's no record of what happened to them. They disappeared into historical obscurity while Carnegie's name went on buildings that will stand for centuries. So we're left with 2 competing legacies. On one side, 2,509 libraries, universities, foundations, institutions that have educated millions and funded important work. On the other side, mass graves of workers whose names no one recorded, families destroyed by poverty, communities devastated by monopolistic practices. We're left with a legacy that depends entirely on which part of the story you choose to emphasize. And we're left with 4 sentences, whispered by a dying man to a nurse who had no reason to lie. I didn't give it all away. I kept enough to make sure they would remember me. I thought that mattered. It doesn't. Those words didn't make it into Carnegie's official biography. They're not engraved on the buildings that bear his name. They're not taught in business schools when professors discuss the gospel of wealth. But they might be the most honest thing Andrew Carnegie ever said. They might be the only moment in his entire carefully managed public life when he told the complete truth about what his fortune cost and whether his giving actually changed anything. The Carnegie myth survives because people need it to survive. We need to believe that extreme wealth and moral goodness can coexist, that you can be a good billionaire if you just give enough away before you die. Carnegie's legacy makes that belief possible. But Carnegie himself didn't die believing it. The one person who heard his actual final words recorded a very different message, a confession, an admission that it was all about ego and immortality, and that even on those terms he failed. The buildings will stand, The foundations will continue. Carnegie's name will be remembered long after everyone reading this is dead. He got the immortality he paid for. But he also spent his final conscious moment admitting it wasn't worth what it cost to get it. And that admission, buried in an obscure journal for decades, might be the most important part of his entire story. Next week, I'm covering the economic policy every Depression-era president tried to implement and failed, until FDR stole it from a socialist who died broke. That video goes live next Sunday. YouTube thinks you'll like this video on screen about how Rockefeller used strategic donations to transform from the most hated man in America to a beloved philanthropist. Same playbook, different billionaire. Click it now.